One of the most intriguing and curious legends in Cincinnati's history is the story about the abandoned subway station. The idea for Cincinnati's subway was an underground loop around downtown that would then pop up above ground and run track to the suburbs around the city, making quick transit for anyone to move from the suburbs to downtown and vice versa. Henry Hunt's subway vision was detailed, ambitious, and pragmatic. The subway station was finally Cincinnati's solution to the public transit issue. No more congested downtown areas. The subway will provide families in Cincinnati quick access to go watch the Reds at the ballpark, go to work downtown, and go eat at a new chili parlor about to open very soon. And the subway will be the fantastic solution to the subway station is not getting built. What? The subway station is not getting built. What? We've already spent millions of dollars and laid 2 miles of tracks. The subway station is not getting built. We want better transit for the city.
Yep.
And a subway is a detailed plan that can solve that problem.
Yep.
Cincinnati has struggled since its founding to find reliable and quick transit, and with expanding suburbs around the city, this subway could be the solution.
That makes sense to me.
So let's build the subway. The subway station is not getting built.
Oh, you get...
So, why wasn't Cincinnati's subway station built? Well, I plan on doing an entire video about this subway in the future, so, you know. But because there's other topics I want to get to, in a nutshell, the idea of the subway was not as valued as something else among Cincinnati voters. Money! It would have been pretty pricey for taxpayers to pay to get the subway station built. Many voters seem to value keeping their taxes low, as opposed to raising taxes to build the subway. During World War I, many of the resources necessary to build the subway were redirected to the war effort, and after the war the prices of everything inflated. By the time the city had even remotely considered rebuilding the subway, the automobile had become more available and was preferred over public transit. The subway project began in 1911, and for a time the project would continue, then it would be discontinued. Then it would continue again, and then it would be discontinued again, and then it would be continued, and then be discontinued, until the Great Depression when the project was officially abandoned for good. So this partially completed subway underneath the city was never finished, and it was left abandoned. And as I'm recording this, the future of the subway is pretty much in limbo, but the city has made it pretty clear it's never going to be used for its original purpose, as you know, a subway. You know, there's someone we haven't talked about in a while. The Germans of Cincinnati. As Cincinnati started to expand to the suburbs, many Cincinnati Germans followed suit and left over the Rhine and moved into some of these nifty suburbs. By the early 1900s, instead of being cramped into one neighborhood, Germans were all over the Cincinnati area. Now kids, we're going to do a little thought experiment. I want you to imagine for me. Pretend you're walking through present-day Over the Rhine. Let's say you're at Washington Park, which I don't have time to talk about, so here's some random facts. After hanging out at Washington Park, you're walking through Over the Rhine. And when you're walking through Over the Rhine, you walk along Republic Street. When you see the street sign for Republic Street, beneath it you see a second street sign, Bremen Street. You wonder, why are there two different street signs for the same road? Now, you continue your walk through Over the Rhine, and you walk to Findlay Market, which I also don't have time to talk about, so here's some more random facts. Along the walk up to Findlay Market, you keep noticing there are all these signs indicating that Republic Street is also named Bremen Street. When you get to Findlay Market, you look around Findlay Market and you see this sign, something about anti-German hysteria, and you start remembering the street signs you saw earlier. That street sign said Bremen. Bremen is a port city in Germany, and you remember, Bremen was the main port city that most of the immigrants from Germany that arrived in Cincinnati left from. This whole neighborhood is heavily German influenced. Tall, thin, and close homes with narrow alleyways. Original German text on many of the buildings. Many of these buildings have German names. So it would make sense that some of the street names would also be German named. So you're wondering, maybe Republic Street used to be called Bremen Street, and maybe it was changed for some reason? Well, you'd be correct. In fact, it wasn't just Bremen Street, it was much of the German influence across the city at this time was starting to be removed. And it wasn't just Cincinnati, it was the entire United States at this time was starting to remove any German influence. Why was the US starting to remove so much of the German influence at this time? The reason was a little something called World War won. During the Great War, anti-German sentiment spread across the United States. Woodrow Wilson originally promised to keep the U.S. out of war, but then in 1917, USA declared war on Germany. To help persuade public opinion, propaganda was distributed across the USA by the Wilson administration, depicting Germans as barbaric savages. Discrimination against German Americans skyrocketed across the USA. Anything German was changed to something more American. Hamburgers became Liberty sandwiches. Sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage. The anti-German sentiment exploded across the USA, but in cities like Cincinnati with large German populations and influence, the anti-German hysteria struck even harder. In Cincinnati, Bremen Street was changed to Republic Street. Berlin Street became Woodrow Street. Hanover Street would be changed to George Washington 4th of July Semi-Automatic Cowboy Deep Fried Big Mac Baldy Avenue. Okay, I made that last one up, but a total of 13 street names would be changed across Cincinnati from their German-sounding names to something more American. Now, while changing the name of food and street signs maybe doesn't seem like that big of a deal, all this anti-German hysteria was a symptom of a greater discrimination that was sweeping the nation and negatively impacting the lives of many German Americans. During this time, German books pulled off Cincinnati library shelves. The teaching of German language and German history classes were restricted by the Cincinnati School Board. German newspapers were censored. Many Germans had to change their names so they wouldn't stand out to avoid prejudice. Their unique German culture was no longer appreciated, and German families were under enormous pressure to conform or be subject to discrimination, or potentially worse. Many outspoken politicians and angry citizens were quick to forget all the positives these German immigrants had brought to their lives. World War I and the anti-German hysteria also helped contribute to Prohibition. Prohibition was pretty awful for everyone in Cincinnati not named George Remus, because Prohibition devastated one of the largest industries in Cincinnati at the time, brewing. Cincinnati at one time used to have more brews per capita than anywhere in the USA. After Prohibition, almost all of Cincinnati's breweries had closed. Prohibition as well devastated the Over-the-Rhine neighborhood. Many who lived in the Over-the-Rhine at the time were employed by the breweries. When all the breweries closed, many of them fled to neighboring towns to find work and essentially left Over-the-Rhine a ghost town. So many of the drinking establishments closed. While many restaurants and bars were closing in Cincinnati in the 1920s, one restaurant was opening. Empress Chili Parlor would open in Cincinnati in 1922, which fast forward a little bit would basically be the starting point for Cincinnati getting Skyline Chili a couple decades later. So regardless of whatever sad history I talk about from this point forward, at least we know the residents of Cincinnati had Cincinnati Chili to get them through the difficult times. Maybe you like Skyline Chili. Maybe you're wrong. My record is 7 conies in one sitting, and yes, Skyline, I'm still waiting on you to use this picture.
Together, at last it's Skyline time.
Now, around this time, wealthier residents were living comfortably in the suburbs. Lower income residents were still living trapped in the basin. At the time, nearly 100,000 residents lived in this area, and much of it was tenement housing, with cramped, overcrowded apartments. Many of these housing units were lacking basic necessities that were more common, such as toilets or lighting. This dude, Jacob Schmidlap, would help hundreds of lower income families receive high quality apartments with more space and utility in some of these Cincinnati suburbs. When he died, the process of providing better housing for lower income residents slowed down. Now that some of these lower income residents had moved from out of Over-the-Rhine to the suburbs, the basin in Cincinnati was left even more vacant, which attracted new residents to move in. However, the housing problems of this area were not addressed. This area was now considered even more undesirable and cheaper than ever before. New, low-income residents flooded into Over-the-Rhine in greater numbers than ever before. That's what we call, kiddos, a recipe for disaster. Now, due to the turnover of Cincinnati's government since the retirement of Boss Cox... Hey, no snickering. The new bigwigs in charge were not as well organized or efficient in addressing some of these problems across the city as Boss Cox was. The roads crumbled, and potholes became more common. To address these issues, taxes would need to be raised. Many Cincinnati residents didn't want to raise taxes, in large part because the residents didn't believe their government would be capable of addressing these problems even if they had the money. Many Cincinnati residents developed a pessimistic view of their government at this time, due to years of proven corruption and inefficiency. Realizing that trust needed to be reestablished between the residents and the Cincinnati government, a new group stepped up in the 1920s. Made up of war vets returning from service, as well as this dude, Cincinnati quickly became the platform for new leadership in the city. Debates were had over which direction to take Cincinnati. These debates admittedly did not always go Cincinnati's way, and public opinion on the organization fell. Reform attempts would continue throughout the years though. A new draft would be drawn up to help reorganize the government. And while we're on the topic, kids, you see, there's a word for a lot of what we've been talking about. We've been talking about how Cincinnati became the city it is today. What decisions were made to help bring the city to where it is? What decisions make sense? Who should make these decisions for our city? How do we pay for these decisions? What should all these people that work for the government do? Basically, what decisions do we make to organize the place we live? There's a word for all of that. That word is politics. If you want to learn more about politics, studying history is a great way to start. Another way to learn about politics is to bring it up at Thanksgiving dinner. So as far as politics, what did all this political reform mean for Cincinnati? What this reform allowed for was it allowed for a bipartisan mix of Democrats and Republicans to the council that were willing to reach across the aisle to allow for what was best for the city instead of stubbornly digging their partisan heels in. One political family from Cincinnati was the Taft family. Alphonso Taft was a judge that would move to Cincinnati and have 5 sons. One of his sons was Mr. William Howard Taft. Willie Boy climbed the political ladder, and in 1908, William Howard Taft became the 27th President of the United States of America. That's right, Cincinnati kiddos. A child just like you growing up in the Queen City was able to become president alongside the likes of these great men. And you can visit his childhood home to this day. William Howard Taft, that was once a child from Cincinnati just like you, was able to become president. Dream big, Cincinnati kiddos. This could be you. William Howard Taft, the 27th President of the United States of America, was so fat they got stuck in a bathtub. For the first time since Cincinnati entered in the top 10 most populated cities, Cincinnati had dropped out of the top 10. Cincinnati was not even top 15 largest U.S. city, and it was getting lapped by neighboring cities such as Pittsburgh.
This guy stinks!
During this time across the nation, big business projects were becoming more common in major cities. Cincinnati wanted to get in on this action. These projects would take Cincinnati's skyline from this to starting to resemble the skyline we're more familiar with today. Some of those iconic buildings in Cincinnati to this day were built during this time to help illustrate the prosperity of the Queen City. All these new Goliath construction projects began to help shape the Cincinnati skyline. But there was still one more project about to go underway. A 48-story building with a department store, restaurants, and over 1,000 hotel rooms. The Carew Tower, a city within a city, at the corner of Vine and 5th, would be completed in October of 1930. Other projects such as Crone Conservatory were completed around this time as well as work on a new $41 million railroad facility, Union Terminal. Murals around the interior of the building were dedicated to the Cincinnati workers. All these major construction projects provided jobs for many Cincinnati families, and they did temporarily soften the blow of the Great Depression, but eventually the full impact of the Great Depression would hit Cincinnati like it did the rest of the country, but Cincinnati would handle it about as well as you could. The Great Depression would actually not be the biggest disaster for Cincinnati that decade. In January of 1937, heavy rains pounded the Midwest, and on the morning of January 16, 1937, the Ohio River rose to 51.5 feet, but then the water slowly started to drop down to 49 feet. Cincinnati residents believed that the threat was over, but meteorologists warned that the worst was yet to come. Rescue efforts were dispatched across the city, and rescued and cared for thousands of people made homeless by the flood. Music Hall became a relief center where clothing and supplies were distributed. Many of the city's transit railways, as well as communication lines, became inaccessible. The Carew Tower actually began offering sightseers the opportunity to watch the flood from the 48th floor observation deck for 25 cents. By January 23rd, the water had reached 72 feet, and on January 24th, infamously known as Black Sunday in Cincinnati, the floodwaters reached 73.4 feet. Cincinnati residents watched helpless as their homes and livelihoods were demolished. The January flood of 1937 had surpassed the 2 worst previous floods that had hit the city. The flood also triggered a fire that spread across Mill Creek Valley and covered 3.5 square miles. The rising waters made the firefighting effort difficult and required effort from hundreds of firefighters from neighboring counties. On January 26th, the floodwater peaked at 80 feet. 45 square miles of Hamilton County were underwater. Over 61,000 were homeless, and it wasn't until February 5th that the water dropped below flood level and businesses would reopen and the lives of Cincinnati residents would attempt to continue as normal. During this time, the West End area had become home to many of the poorest residents of Cincinnati. The city proposed the idea of clearing large areas of slum housing to build medium-sized apartments in present-day this location of West End called the Laurel Homes. This decision to build housing in this area was controversial, as many believed it would disproportionately displace black residents living there. Black residents' fears became even more realized when they discovered the city's plans involved barring black residents from moving into these new homes. The Cincinnati Metropolitan Housing Authority had the plans of building 3 separate housing units, 1 for blacks and 2 for whites. But once the plan was enacted, only 1 neighborhood unit was built and it was for whites only. Only after pressure from the Better Housing League were black residents allowed to move into the Laurel Homes. Out of the hundreds of black families displaced by this project, only about 30% of black families were given units to live in, and they still remain segregated from the white families within the community. At the end of the 1930s, Europe was already involved in another conflict, a little something called World War II. World War II really helped alleviate unemployment across the USA at this time, as military jobs were created, as well as civil works to help create supplies necessary for the war effort. Heading into the 1940s, many Cincinnati residents had witnessed a couple great tragedies strike their city, and their government respond responsibly and do a reliable job caring for the citizens. The reforms in the 1920s prior to these tragedies helped reinstall trust Cincinnati citizens had in their government and raised expectations. Cincinnati over the last couple decades had built towering skyscrapers, reinventing the city's skyline. However, many of the older buildings were now kinda ugly looking, not serving much purpose, and potentially in the way of new development. Plans were drawn up for new development across the city. This new development would become known as the 1948 Master Plan. Part of the 1948 Master Plan was to create a boulevard on 3rd Street that would then connect the expressways that led to neighboring major cities. These new routes would prevent people from trying to pass through the city from crowding the interior streets of Cincinnati. These routes would also allow for anyone traveling into the city to get off the highway and into the city in one fine swoop. All the vacant buildings in between 3rd Street and the river were going to need to move it or lose it to make room for some new hotspots. I'm talking new apartment buildings, new parks, new sports stadiums, and plenty, and I mean plenty, believe me, when I say plenty, of parking space. While new highways often do make for more convenient travel, some people believe highways also take away from a lot of the charm and the beauty of a city. Part of the development of these new highways also involved stretches of highway that would run through an area close to present-day West End.
This area today is where the Queensgate neighborhood is. Queensgate neighborhood isn't home to much. At one point, however, this area used to have 25,000 residents living here. Well, how can you build highways where 25,000 people live? Easy. Thanks to a plan that was introduced at this time called the Kenyon Bar Renewal Project. Kenyon Bar was a plan introduced by the city that called for building highways right here. The problem with that, there's an entire neighborhood here. This area of Lower West End specifically had 2,600 buildings consisting of over 7,000 housing units. As well as this area of Lower West End was home to over 25,000 low-income residents, over 97% were black. The city sent letters to the residents living in Lower West End and said, "Hey, we're your government, and we're going to destroy your homes so we can build some highways. We're also not going to give you any reparations or alternatives for destroying your homes and lives." The city justified the destruction of these homes by considering it slum clearance, because many of the buildings did not meet the code requirements at the time. But to the residents living here, this was a close-knit community, and the Kenyon Bar project demolished this entire area of Lower West End and displaced 25,000 low-income black residents. The construction of the highways destroyed the lives of thousands of residents in Cincinnati who were already struggling with no plan in place to help them get back on their feet. Many believe the destruction of this area is one of the biggest blights in Cincinnati's history.
I wouldn't be doing the full story justice by simplifying the story down to that, so I would encourage you to learn about that on your own time, or look out for a video in the future. At this point, the city realized something else. Cincinnati was too large to function as a single entity. Thus, the city would categorize the individual neighborhoods into communities. This reorganization saw that each community would have their own schools, playgrounds, community centers. As the suburbs sprang up around Cincinnati, big, gigantic shopping centers and other retail outlets began to crush smaller businesses downtown. As many of these residents left the overcrowded city to flee to the suburbs, poor black residents as well as poor Appalachian whites filled in these lower-priced, overcrowded, less desirable homes closer to downtown, over the Rhine, and the West End. And remember those Kenyon Bar residents I mentioned were displaced? Many of them also filled in these areas as well. So now, you have a lot of poor residents, even more than before, jam-packed, living on top of each other, with very little money or resources in these areas of the city. Once again, kids, say it with me. Recipe for disaster. Some low-income housing options would be attempted by Cincinnati Metropolitan Housing Authority, but many of these residents living in the suburbs would push back on them not to be built. Neighborhoods such as these absorbed many of the poor black residents displaced by this housing destruction. All across the U.S. at this time, race relations began to boil up. Black citizens had spent decades being treated as second-class citizens, and decision-making across the country made it nearly impossible for them to afford proper housing or to get on equal footing with their white counterparts. Segregated from businesses and schooling, discriminated against in job opportunities, made building wealth for black families nearly impossible. Throughout the 1960s, protests took place across the country. Cincinnati and the United States in general were kind of dragging their feet on racial equality, and before the end of the decade, riots broke out across the country, including in Cincinnati. The spark of these riots in Cincinnati was conviction of a man named Post Steele Lasky. Lasky was convicted of assaulting and killing a white woman. Around this time, there were 6 unsolved murders across Cincinnati. Many black residents thought Lasky was an innocent scapegoat and was being framed during a height of white paranoia. Black residents took to Cincinnati streets to protest the conviction of Lasky. These protests in the day turned to full-scale rioting by night. The Cincinnati Police Department deployed nearly 300 officers to put down the riot, followed by 1,000 National Guard members. After the riot, meetings were had with Cincinnati City Council and black leaders. These meetings, that were supposed to be a peaceful, productive exchange of ideas, quickly became hostile. The meetings became angry shouting matches, and before the night was over, riots broke out again. These riots continued for the next 2 days across the city as black and white leaders worked together to de-escalate the riots, and by the end of the week, police and the National Guard presence were no longer necessary. Riots caused the city a couple $1 million and led to hundreds of arrests. While Cincinnati's race riots were smaller compared to what was happening around the country this time, many Cincinnati residents were so shocked that something like this could happen in their city. In the months following the riots, small changes were made to help address issues more specific to black residents in Cincinnati in areas like Avondale and along Reading Road. With all the changes happening to downtown, Cincinnati decided the downtown area really needed a jungle. The Cincinnati Bengals joined the NFL in 1967 and have given us iconic moments such as this, and this. The Bengals have historically not quite had the same success that the Reds have, but and just so I can say I mentioned them, here are some other famous athletes with ties to Cincinnati. By the early 1970s, the downtown look was already starting to come to fruition. The city also wanted to plan to address another issue. Through a big fat $15 million grant from the federal government, Cincinnati was able to address concerns about flooding. With new development for places like Yeatman's Cove, had a large serpentine wall to deter floods in 1976. Sawyer Point Park was built in 1978, and big residential buildings like Lyle Place in 1980. Also, this area became home to the new Reds and Bengal Stadium. Now, with all these modern changes, old structures would often be torn down to build newer, more efficient structures. There was concern by some of the residents. They wanted to make sure that Cincinnati still maintained the identity of its past culture as well. As blocks of the city were under construction, hot debates were held to find the balance of bringing in the new with preserving the historical identity of the city. While these debates raged on, you will not be surprised to find that often the tide goes to the idea of tearing down the old to build something new. It was the case for Cincinnati then, and it is unfortunately the case for Cincinnati now. However, the best way to save iconic buildings was to find new uses for them. Music Hall went under a $5 million renovation in the early 70s. Historic preservation added hundreds of these buildings to the National Historic Registry, as well as other landmarks. During the 1970s, some of Cincinnati's most honored traditions hosted their first events, such as Cincinnati's first Oktoberfest, as well as the WBN fireworks. Starting in the 1970s as well, Cincinnati would, Hey, what's that noise? Oh yes, I almost forgot to mention. In the 1970s, Cincinnati had this dude as mayor, Jerry Springer. Jerry Springer had quite a roller coaster every life. Speaking of roller coasters, here's some facts about Coney Island. Anyways, back to Jerry Springer. Jerry was an American broadcaster, journalist, actor, lawyer, and politician. Jerry was on Cincinnati City Council in the mid-1970s, but Jerry had to resign after he wrote a check for some kind of interesting reasons. But that didn't stop him from becoming Cincinnati's mayor a few years later. Springer went on to host a show called The Jerry Springer Show for nearly 30 years, the number one show for kids that stayed home sick from school during the 1990s. And because of the success of this show, Jerry would become a household name worldwide. Any questions? Yes. What did Jerry Springer write the checks for? What? You said Jerry got in trouble for writing checks. What did he write the checks for? Yeah, so anyway, in January of 1977, Cincinnati would be hit with a blizzard that would catch nationwide attention. One of the most iconic moments in Cincinnati's history, as residents were actually able to walk across the frozen Ohio River.
Everybody get off the ice.
A couple years later, Cincinnati would catch nationwide attention again. On December 3rd, 1979, the British rock band The Who came to Cincinnati for a concert. Thousands of fans gathered outside Riverfront Coliseum. Waiting in the cold, fans became impatient and began to crush their way towards the door, pinning and crushing others in the process. Only once the melee cleared and concertgoers made their way inside was the aftermath evident. Dozens were injured and 11 were killed. The concert proceeded on as normal, as most people attending the concert were unaware of the magnitude of what even happened, including the band themselves. This concert was largely responsible for the way concert seating changed across the country. I mentioned for many years, families were moving from the city to the suburbs and were living in homes about a 10 to 20 minute drive from downtown. But some people around this time began to value something different other than what these suburban homes had to offer. In the 1980s, neighborhoods closer to downtown saw an influx of 20 to 30 something year olds who were rehabbing these old homes and moving into them. The reason why they prefer these homes varied. However, this kids is a fancy word that some people like to call gentrification. Gentrification is probably a little too complex of an issue to discuss in detail in this sort of video. Here is a brief definition. If you want to learn more about gentrification, again, it's another great topic to bring up during Thanksgiving dinner. In the 1980s, Cincinnati would begin work on developing downtown with the Cincinnati 2000 plan. Some of the major goals of Cincinnati's 2000 plan: preserve historic buildings, increase the amount of downtown living space, more office space, have more skywalks and reduce sidewalks to make foot transit more accessible, more green space and trees to make the area more attractive, and we were apparently supposed to have a light rail system using the abandoned subway station. This plan gave Cincinnati a strong sense that while the city may have had a dwindling population for much of the 20th century, the city believed that it could be on the upswing heading into the 21st century, installing a new sense of pride in Cincinnati that many of the residents had not seen in nearly 100 years. In the early 1990s, Cincinnati's Union Terminal saw the opening of Cincinnati's History Museum, as well as the return of Amtrak service. Cincinnati Enquirer Jim Borgman won a Pulitzer Prize as a satirical social cartoonist. In 1992, the Cincinnati Newport Bridge would be demolished to make way for the Taylor Southgate Bridge. Beginning in the late 80s and into the 90s, Cincinnati would begin to incorporate another era of Cincinnati's history into present-day Cincinnati pop culture: the iconic flying pig. Many of the flying pigs you see around Cincinnati would make their first appearances around this time, as well as the Flying Pig Marathon would host its first race in 1999. At the Flying Pig Marathon, the runners crossed the finish swine. Finish swine? Get it? Like finish line? But instead of line, it's swine. Finish line. Finish swine. because another name for a pig is Paul Brown Stadium would be built for the Bengals in 2001, and Riverfront Stadium would be demolished, and Great American Ballpark would be built in its place in 2003. In fact, the whole downtown area seems to be getting revitalized by the early 2000s. But at the turn of the century, as momentum was starting to pick back up for Cincinnati, chaos was on the horizon.
On April 7th, 2001, 19-year-old Timothy Thomas was walking along Vine Street and Over the Rhine. Two off-duty officers noticed Thomas, who was wanted for over a dozen misdemeanor warrants. The officers approached Thomas and a foot chase ensued. When Officer Stephen Roach cornered Thomas in an alleyway, Roach alleged that he saw Thomas reach into his waistband. Assuming that Thomas was reaching for a gun, Roach shot and killed Thomas. When the dust was settled, it was revealed Thomas was unarmed. Thomas's death lit the fuse under what was already a hostile relationship between black citizens and the Cincinnati police heading into the early 2000s. Outraged citizens took to City Hall to express their frustration. The meeting was not very productive, and a contentious crowd spilled over into the streets, and before the night was over, some of the largest riots in Cincinnati's history were in full swing. A citywide curfew would be implemented in an attempt to regain control of the city. Riots, vandalism, and arson lasted for nearly a week as Cincinnati police finally got the rioting under control. Following the days of the riots, Cincinnati leaders signed the Collaborative Agreement. This agreement led to major changes in policing in Cincinnati, as well as citywide initiatives to reduce violence.
After the chaos of the 2001 riots, improvements would continue across downtown, such as the Cincinnati Freedom Museum would open in 2004, and changes were made so that foot transit was easier, and more outdoor dining areas and tailgate areas were built. In 2006, Fountain Square was renovated again. A little fundraiser called SantaCon hosted its first event in 2007, which now at this point is nearly a 20-year tradition in Cincinnati.
Yeah, you're getting old, pal.
And remember how I said that Prohibition had killed the brewing industry across the city? Well, beginning around the early 2010s, craft breweries had revitalized Cincinnati's brewing industry. Because of the facelift given to downtown, people were excited to go downtown again. The downtown area, which at one point was essentially a big parking lot, became beautiful, spacious, green Smale Park. Other events such as Blink hosted their first event in 2017, and all these events and renovations made to downtown continue to help revitalize Cincinnati. New apartment buildings, new restaurants, and bars. Downtown by 2010 became the most desirable and attractive it had been in nearly 100 years. Downtown is really getting transformed. And beginning in the 2010s, a similar transformation was going to shake up one of the most historic neighborhoods in the city, Over the Rhine. I mentioned starting in the 1920s, Over the Rhine became pretty undesirable to live in. This was happening for decades. Lots of poverty in this historic neighborhood. By the early 2000s, Over the Rhine was consistently ranked as one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the USA. In 2009, it was number 1, the most dangerous neighborhood in the USA. All that separated Over the Rhine from the blossoming downtown area was Central Parkway, the path of the old Miami-Erie Canal. Well, change was on the way. Millions of dollars would be poured into Over the Rhine to revitalize areas like Washington Park and Music Hall. More streetlights and cameras were implemented to help deter criminals. In a few short years, craft breweries, restaurants, and coffee shops have lines out the door. New apartments are built in some of these old historic buildings. 3CDC is a nonprofit organization that is largely responsible for the renovation projects across the Over the Rhine neighborhood during this time. In less than a decade, Over the Rhine went from one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the country to one of the most fun areas in Cincinnati. And it really is difficult to over-exaggerate the transformation Over the Rhine has seen over the last 15 years. I personally believe the forming of 3CDC is the best thing to happen to Cincinnati in my lifetime. I think 3CDC is fantastic. And the way 3CDC has improved Over the Rhine and just the downtown area in general has basically become a textbook example for other cities trying to revitalize their urban cores. Now, 2015 to 2017 is oddly one of the most unique eras of Cincinnati's history, because this 2-year stretch would very strangely consist of 4 different examples of Cincinnati, for much different reasons, catching international attention and being the center of the biggest stories in the world for a brief period of time. So the first of these 4 stories involves my high school classmate Lauren Hill. Lauren Hill was a basketball player at Mount St. Joe University who suffered from terminal brain cancer. Lauren always had a dream of suiting up and playing college basketball, and she wasn't about to let her cancer deter her. Lauren got up and trained with her team every day and managed to play in 4 college basketball games before passing away. Lauren's story inspired people all around the world, and her story helped raise millions of dollars for medical research, and Lauren became a symbol of perseverance and determination. The second story involves a couple living over the Rhine, John Arthur and his boyfriend Jim Obergefell. John had been diagnosed with ALS and only had a few weeks to live. The couple wanted to get married before his death. In Ohio, gay marriage wasn't legal at the time. The couple flew to Maryland, where gay marriage was legal, and the couple was married. They flew back to Ohio. The state of Ohio said, however, they wouldn't recognize Jim as a spouse on the death certificate. Angered by this, Jim sued the state of Ohio, and this court case eventually made its way to the Supreme Court. The case of Obergefell vs. Hodges was ruled 5-4 in favor of the couple, and in 2015, this court decision was largely responsible for legalizing gay marriage across the entire United States. The third example of a Cincinnati resident being the center of international news came the following year, which is maybe out of all these stories the most unsettling and uncomfortable out of all these stories. In 2016, Otto Warmbier, a recent high school graduate of suburban Wyoming High School, went on a 5-day guided tour to heavily isolated North Korea. During this trip, Otto was detained by North Korean authorities, and Otto was accused of stealing a propaganda poster from his hotel. After a very suspicious and possibly staged confession, Otto was sentenced to 15 years of hard labor in North Korea. Very little explanation on Otto's well-being was ever released, and about a year and a half later, Otto was returned to Cincinnati in a comatose state where he would die several days later. This event stunned Americans and rattled what was already a hostile relationship between the US and North Korea. The fourth and final story of Cincinnati catching the international spotlight and becoming worldwide news came on May 28, 2016. That day, a 3-year-old boy climbed into the gorilla habitat of the Cincinnati Zoo. When the boy fell into the habitat, a 17-year-old gorilla named Harambe approached the boy and went, "Hey, come on down to the Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Garden and see our miracle baby Fiona." In January 2017, Fiona would be born premature and would be nursed back to health by her caretakers. Her progress would be documented on social media, making her world famous and her being the biggest attraction at the zoo. Nothing else happened a few months prior. The zoo shut up, stopped talking about it. Cincinnati would get a streetcar that same year, and in 2018, Cincinnati would get a new soccer team, as FC Cincinnati would make their MLS debut, and a couple years later, in 2021, they would get their very own stadium on Central Parkway in Over the Rhine. Here's me catching a ball at a game a few months ago.
In January 2026, Cincinnati opened a new convention center, and on top of that, the best thing Cincinnati has to look forward to going into 2026, they're finally going to do something about this fucking bridge.